Points of tension. Points of tension within communities can often be useful for identifying places where the, let's say, collected lore is insufficient. And this may sound like an odd way to start a subject on what might be might be considered the Big Five within Ranger Battalion, or a subject on what a person should learn when it comes to the grander topic of gun culture. And I bring it up at a time in the year 2024 where there is a deep anticipation within the world on, at least in America, on whether or not we might start seeing this kind of summer of love trend return. And if we go back only to 2020, we don't need to look back very far in a season of civil unrest where violence was taken into the streets and people lost their lives, albeit with not nearly the severity of something like the Bosnian Civil War. But it still was a time where many people suddenly became aware of the fragility of their position. And so if this works as a metaphor, in many ways gun culture expands and contracts over time. It kind of expands. New people come in, some event happens, people enter into gun culture. They're usually welcomed in with open arms, and then as the urgency of a situation or their sense of security returns, then they sort of drift away, only to wash back in with the next wave. The most common pattern would be that of elections every 4 years. The firearms industry makes more money because more people are concerned, whether it's because of a certain political candidate or because of rising tensions spilling out into the streets in their local communities. Now, one of these questions, there's sort of an intersection that we're starting here, and that question is, or not, it's not so much a question, but it's a point of friction that oftentimes comes up in gun culture, which is sort of this, I don't want to just demean it as childish, but it's a simplified edition of which is better, a high-level competition shooter or someone who's been in the military. And on its face, the question is a little bit absurd to think that somebody whose job is to engage, or somebody whose career and development is focused entirely on, or should be on, war making and has a host of responsibilities, is quite different than the person whose sole objective within their environment is to win competitions, and so they get to focus on a smaller set of skills. And you see this kind of this kind of back and forth argument arrive from time to time, sometimes between internet celebrities and sometimes just in like forums and kind of chat rooms. And I think, and I've wanted to bring it up because it actually, what I wanted to do and what was inspired by it was one of you left some comments about something referred to as the Big Five. And it was in reference to Ranger Battalion. Now, here's the funny thing, and here's the problem. Even after spending years in Ranger Battalion, I had not really heard of the Big Five. I had learned of them, but not by that title. So maybe it's a newer rotation or way of describing something, but certainly it was present back in the day. I want to make sure that I bring up Obsidian Arms, the sponsor of this show, and I know that isn't intended to be so much of a smooth transition, but this is actually what's going to be a little bit more important. Recently, I've been putting together a couple of different firearms for different projects. One of them was a BRN 180, and if you made it to the Phoenix public land shoot, you got to actually use that. And the putting together an AR-15 always has certain, let's say, tenuous steps, but Obsidian Arms makes a toolkit that is specifically designed around the maintenance and assembly and disassembly of an AR-15. And that toolkit comes with a lifetime warranty. And so, full disclosure, they sent me one. And in the process of putting together this firearm, I found myself repeatedly thankful for the attention to detail, whether it's in the tolerances and the sizing of parts or in of tools, or the complete selection that was involved, all under the confidence that if I ever did anything wrong on my end, they would replace that part for me. Not the part on the gun, but the part in the toolkit. And so if you are engaged in the profession of gunsmithing, or you are somewhat of a self-sufficient individual and you're looking to make sure you have a toolkit specifically set for firearms assembly, go look at Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. So that's the sponsorship. Now, they have been more than kind to me, and so I want to make sure that they know that I appreciate what they have done, that they wanted to contribute to the intellectual side of gun culture. And so not to spoil the meme, we're about 5 minutes in, so let's get into the meat and potatoes. Now, if we take this sort of back and forth argument that's a little bit caricatured, but it's easy to identify or see within gun culture, or if it's not easy, I want to make sure it becomes so, because I want to be able to kind of dissipate it. In other words, I believe that the problem itself is not purely a problem of skill development, but it is a problem of how we think about what we're doing when we talk about gun culture or use of force or violence and so forth, whether it's preparedness or self-defense or being a responsible citizen. And this caricature of a conversation pits two metaphorical examples of maybe a soldier versus a competition shooter, saying or highlighting that the competition shooter, or the whatever you want to use him as an example, is so much of a better of a shooter than, say, someone whose profession it is to carry a firearm. And you can take the soldier and you can replace it in some sense with a police officer or some other profession, armed professions. But the point still stands that the response that's typically made, let's just say we take a grandmaster in competition shooting, let's use 3 guns, so he's multifaceted. Maybe he's got some skill in PRS too, so sniper, shotgun, AR-15, and a handgun, and compare their skill with a firearm against somebody who maybe have been in the military for 5 years. An example of this is when I got out of the military, I started shooting competition, and I remember going to my first competition thinking I was going to do pretty good. And while I didn't finish at the bottom of the pack, I wasn't in the top half. At least I remember, if I can remember right. And what that showed, what that illustrated was, for my first competition, new environment, new rules, a lot of the things were new. At least I had the base skill set to perform, or let's call it manipulate, the tools. But it was very different in a sense to what I was doing in the military. And so the response that's oftentimes made is, well, a soldier has multiple jobs and multiple responsibilities, more than just shooting. There is more to going to war than being able to hit your target. And an example of this would be what is referred to as the Big Five when it comes to Ranger Battalion. Now, they refer to it as a philosophy, but I would be a little bit remiss to give them that title. It's maybe more of a series of values or a set of standards that they want to pursue, a priority of work, so to speak. And those Big Five are marksmanship, physical training, medical training, small unit tactics, and mobility. Now, and what they mean by Big Five, and on this, how you'd look at it in the scale, is whether you're looking at an individual or at a squad or team or platoon or battalion, you should be able to look at, no matter how many soldiers your rangers, let's just say, you're dealing with in your level of analysis, you should be able to analyze them on these 5 points. How good is their marksmanship? What is their physical fitness like? Are they up to date on medical training for first response and the types of threats that they might be facing? And then how capable are they at reaching their locations? Are they mobile via vehicle, mobile via foot, and so on and so forth? But I want to break these down, because when we look at gun culture as a whole, you see these points of friction where the minutia becomes the macro, where something that is small or something that is only one part of the puzzle starts to consume the entirety of a person's worldview. Most comically, the example would be everything is CQB, or in a way of looking at communications, don't trust anyone, everyone's a Fed. But but let's just take the most basic example of what marksmanship would look like in a professional capacity. to an individual who's looking to purchase their own firearms and they're looking to and they are interested in their own self-defense, or they're participating, they believe it as a meaningful participation in the well-being of their community, we might think of marksmanship as simply being able to use a firearm to hit a target. And in a sense, it is that simple, but if you want to break it down a little bit more complex, or a little bit more thoroughly, to somebody whose profession includes the bearing of arms, they might be up to the position of learning to shoot from multiple different positions, whether it's standing, kneeling, prone, inside or outside of a vehicle, and all of the nuances with that, behind barricades, around barriers, in different environments, whether it's hot, cold, high altitude, and so on and so forth. So marksmanship is much more than being at a flat range, but of course we knew that. But what else can it include? Well, it might also include being able to be effective with a tool, be able to hit your target wearing different types of gear, whether it's a rucksack or a chest rig or a plate carrier. Perhaps it might mean being proficient in multiple firearms or multiple weapon systems, like a pistol, a rifle, a rocket launcher, a belt-fed machine gun, or even a grenade launcher. And then you can even expand it further to things like flashbangs, frag grenades, bangers, which bangers, crashes, flashbangs, all the same thing, claymores, and breaching devices, and so on and so forth. So if we are going to, instead of just say that there's more to being a soldier or more to being an effective soldier than just shooting, if we even just look at the category of marksmanship, we are looking at multiple categories well beyond the scale of what is typically presented in any type of, well, competition shooting, but also, let's expand a little bit further, most normal civilian capable shooting. There might be longer distance. You could compare that to hunting, and certainly there is a lot of crossover between being able to hunt an elk in a high altitude environment and being capable of functioning in what one might consider a sniper team. But if we, I want to go back to this subject. If we just look at the category of marksmanship, we have already expanded on the idea of shooting in gun culture well beyond what is typified in most generic situations. To a ranger, shooting would be including, and I'll go over them again, shooting from different positions, standing, kneeling, prone, from different environments, hot weather, hot, cold, wet weather, low light, high light, whatever. You might also deal with inside of vehicles, outside of vehicles, inside of a building, outside of a building, and then you've got wearing different gear, ruck, chest rig, plate carrier, so long and so forth. What about gas masks? And then you can even go further, various weapon systems, pistols, rifles, belt-fed machine guns, and grenade launchers and rocket launchers, and so on and so forth. And then you might even specialize further than that. You might have people that are particularly developed for the use of long-distance, quote-unquote, sniper rifles, and so on and so forth. And then you have something that I believe should fall under the category of marksmanship, which is proficiency with things like bangers, flashbangs, frag grenades, claymores, and so forth. So what happens when we move on from marksmanship? Well, the second of the big five is considered physical training. And instead of trying to compare civilian life to the military, I think what's more important here is identifying when it goes wrong. And I think we can all agree to some reasonability that if reaching the standards or appearing to reach the standards becomes so important that it becomes the objective itself, then the way that we're looking at fitness is wrong. Let's just say the standards for a unit is you have to do 50 push-ups in 1 minute, which is a pretty fast pace. Now, what does being able to do 50 push-ups have anything to do with fighting in a war? Well, there are some answers to that, but what I think is more important is identifying what happens, what goes wrong when the standards become the objective itself, and the unit or the individual loses sight of what their goal is and what their fitness is for. What is the ideal when it comes to physical training in the environment and the situation and the objectives they're focusing on? Now, setting standards for a team is good for the team. Not only does it help with morale when everybody meets it, but also it is a method of weeding out people who are not willing to, let's say, pay their dues, so to speak. So physical training ought be something like being capable of completing the task with enough energy and physicality in reserve to move on to multiple contingencies multiple times. I was talking to a man who was a former SEAL, and he said it very clearly. It was Cole from GBRS Group, and he said something that like even you can learn from other people, but he said something that I thought was quite interesting. He said, and it's not so much that it's profound; it's that a person, a SEAL or a Ranger or whoever it is, should be physically fit enough so that by the time they reach the target building or the objective, they still have plenty of energy in reserve so that they can accomplish the task. Now, we kind of from an outside perspective, this might seem a little obvious, but I want to kind of tell this in a story form. So the idea of a raid is when a group of people attack a location, specifically looking for a target individual or weapons or some sort of destructive device or information, and then they leave. And so to raid a building is different than capturing a building, or it's different than like not even fortifying one, but it is when a group of people, let's call it a platoon, moves to a location, attacks a target, acquires the vital material or personnel that they were there for, and then leaves. They don't fortify and turn it into their own base. It's not about taking land. And it's not uncommon, especially in our era of the night raid, where soldiers, Rangers particularly, or even special operations guys will land a helicopter, or they might travel to, let's just say, 5 kilometers away from the target building and move 5 kilometers wearing all of their gear, all of their kit, wearing all of their stuff while maintaining situational awareness. And then before they reach their target building, they're going to hold what's called an RP or a rally point. And then from there, they'll attack the target. Now, that movement is called movement to target. And that is, so infill, get off the helicopter. That's what an infill is. And then movement to target is the amount of movement from where they left the vehicle to when they're preparing to strike a target building or raid a target building. And if that's about 4 or 5 kilometers, and if that 4 or 5, which contextually will be explained otherwise, but let's just say your movement to target is 5 kilometers. If you get to the target building and you're out of energy, how are you going to do the job? And this can look, what this means is, and this is why I thought it was important to share, why I think what Cole's words were actually easy to, or should not be missed, was that infiltration oftentimes presented in new guys a sense of dread because they had to carry all this weight from one point to another. It's kind of like a ruck march. There's a lot of physical energy expended in that time. But the idea, and so you'd want to make sure you're carrying as little weight as possible. But the idea that's important in this one is that the weight, not the fitness of the individuals needed to be at such, morally ought be at such a capacity so that the movement to the objective doesn't wear them out. And so if you can think of the farthest that you might need to move on foot, carrying a full load to, let's just say, quote, secure groceries or something, double that, and that is what your movement fitness should be at a bare minimum. Let's just say you live 4 miles from town or 3 miles from town. You live 3 miles from town. There's a market or a friend with a farm that carries something that you need, and in your metaphorical, not post-apocalyptic, but like kind of lockdown, disaster-ish situation, how far do you need to move to rendezvous with somebody and then move back? That's your 3 miles times 2, 6 miles, or 4 miles times 2, 8 miles. You should be able to move comfortably in your equipment, every single part of your equipment that you think you might be carrying in that kind of movement during that time. And then there are all these other activities that you might need to do, like sprinting, bounding, burpees, because your physicality should also be a thing where you're not worried about it. If you're in a position where your fitness could be a liability, that liability can very quickly become a moral liability, especially if you're working in a team. But the ideal of physical fitness should not simply be a set of standards, but you should be physically fit enough that if you are going to have to do something very difficult, you're not only believing that you're capable, not only are you physically capable of doing it, but you are capable of believing that you are capable of doing it, so that it is not a burden on your conscience as you're engaging in difficult activities. Now, medical training is an easy one to nail down in my world because we've already covered marksmanship and physical training, and medical training comes down to what I think an average prepared, let's call it a prepared citizen or responsible citizen, whatever you want to call the title, gun culture person should be able to do is have familiarity with something called March. March is not rewriting the book. It's just simply a way of assessing and keeping a list of information available in the event that there is an emergency situation. There's a first aid situation, and March begins with massive hemorrhaging or bleeding. If you approach a car crash, a motorcycle crash, or a gunshot wound, is there massive bleeding? If so, where? And then after that, we go to airway. Are they breathing, or if they're not breathing, is there something obstructing their airway? And then after A is R, respiratory. That includes how many breaths are they taking? What is their breathing pattern looking like? And you can start gathering data. Is a person going into shock by looking at their breath and how they're breathing? And then C stands for circulation, which is going to be how much blood is moving through the body. And this is in a kind of a professional environment. You start seeing things like IVs get put on. And then the last one is heat trauma or head injury or heat injury. I've heard both, but if you're looking at a first aid situation, you want to look for massive bleeding first, then address airway, then look for respiratory, following that circulation, and after that, head trauma, heat injury, small lacerations, and making them comfortable and being able to move them, an injured person, to a care facility for more intensive care. Not to be redundant. So medical training within the context of, even as crazy as it sounds, medical training is probably one of the easiest ones to take care of for an individual, for someone in gun culture, because you can do things like take classes like CPR. You can take short courses or courses that have to do with first responder, even wilderness first responder, an emergency kind of things. You can without even the intent of going into a full career, say like an EMT, there is no real barrier to entry to becoming proficient in basic emergency first aid. And it's worth noting here that the obscurity that goes into medical kits and medical training, especially within large environments like schools and churches and so forth, or smaller environments like just you and your family, you can start to figure out what things that you might want to have on hand by taking a basic course like this. Now, March is a term that's typically used by the military. There's enough veterans out there. We can all have a good conversation about it, but I'm going to leave that pass because we're going to move on. Now, the most controversial one within gun culture is going to be called small unit tactics, sometimes referred to as SUT, S-U-T. And the reason why it's the most controversial is because this is where you get chitty-chat language like Recce versus CQB and so forth. Now, should it be controversial? Maybe, because everyone's environment is different, their circumstances are different, and small unit training becomes something a little bit ambiguous, and it becomes very ambiguous in the environment that we live in right now, because if we were to, say, get together and start building a target package, which would help us set up an objective list and then start planning on how to take out said targets, a federal law enforcement, if they became aware of that, might consider that something illegal. Not only illegal, but it might even, and more importantly, be considered immoral. The idea that we would create a target package, which is no different really than a hit list, and that we were going to start using that alone to assess our small unit tactics for ourselves, is dubious, morally dubious, and legally as well. But there's something more important to apply here, because small unit tactics might be capable of proficiently remaining situationally aware and capable of fighting in your environment. And that includes in a building, in a car, on a road, in a city, in the woods, where you live, on a mountain, and so on and so forth. The issue with small unit tactics and the way that people, I think the problem that you see so much infighting over it is because it's kind of the newer. It's entered into gun culture later than, say, gear and guns. It's not something somebody looks at the early stages of development. It's something that after a little time a person might become more interested in. You're starting to see more courses available for it. And so I really think that the controversy is a little artificial, because it's really just the new thing in gun culture, being able to have access to this idea of small unit tactics at a level that culturally wasn't as much. But we might look at things like, I want to look at small unit tactics and change our perspective away from the mentality and the perspective of somebody who is like a soldier or a ranger, and alter it, rotate it towards who we are as individuals, particularly within gun culture. Small unit tactics to a ranger might be CQB, they might be Battle Drill 1 Alpha, which is react to contact or react to contact or break contact or react to near and far ambush. And those are all useful things for an individual in yours and mine position to know. But there's a lot more that we might actually want to consider. Things like use of force, developing better situational awareness without becoming hyper-focused on the minutiae around us. We also might want to be able to react to contact, break contact, build a pattern of life and observe in a reconnaissance fashion on somebody, and, of course, do everybody's least favorite, CQB, or move and shoot within a house. Think of the dynamics in that environment. And so the one that stands out that's most important, though, when it comes to small unit tactics reverting, or the spirit of small unit tactics in the lives of individuals, would be use of force. And that is something that we need to study both as individuals for moral reasons as well as legal reasons. It's a smart thing to consider. So, so that leaves us with one left of the big five, which is mobility. All right, so closing out the five with mobility, we have something that in our lives might be the most simple, but also the most neglected, one of the most neglected. Mobility, when we think of mobility in a military sense, we might think of being able to do a ruck march and drive a tank and fly in a helicopter and jump out of an airplane. Whereas in our own lives, it's quite simple. It starts, most importantly, with land navigation. And land navigation, why would we, like, the idea that we'd have to explain why someone might want to learn land navigation might feel like an exercise in futility. But this is what it looks like. There's a phenomenon that came about as the ubiquitous phone ended up in everybody's hands, and those phones started having GPS on them, or a navigation tool, and it was that suddenly, out of nowhere, people were traveling a bit wider in their immediate sphere, potentially. But what was more important is that they didn't know where, they did not have immediately accessible knowledge of the layout of their immediate environment. It would be like if you lived on one side of the city, you didn't really know how to get to the other side of the city without GPS, without some sort of tool telling you when to turn, how to move. There is a study, but there's also a principle when it comes to how the human mind learns, and it has to learn through a little bit of adversity. And so that adversity, that tension of trying to figure out where you are and how to get to where you want to go, is the mechanism by which your brain, your mind, learns to associate where it is in a given area. Now, mobility, beginning most with land navigation, can come with a series of practicals. That might be something as simple as learning how to read a map and compass, learning how to read a map and protractor in a rural environment, but then also learning how to acquiring different types of maps, and learning on how to maneuver through the very world and city or town that you live in without getting lost and without relying on something to tell you not only where you are, but how to get to where you're trying to go. Imagine the embarrassment of having to do or being employed in a role where your job is to enact violence on an individual. Let's say raid let's use a mafia example, like some sort of crime syndicate. You go and you kick in the door and you realize, I'm at the wrong house. And then you start getting corrections and you realize not only are you in the wrong house, but you're in the wrong neighborhood. That kind of embarrassment would be worse for a professional, at least in their career development, perhaps career ending for many, but for an individual like you and I is a much more deeply ingrained moral question. So mobility begins with land navigation and then continues on into what do you have for footwear? What do you have for a rucksack? Are you capable of moving your stuff from one place to another? What about your vehicle? Is it in good repair? What kind of does it travel well? These are considerations for reaching a level of capability when it comes to mobility. There might be additional options like motorcycles, dirt bikes, electric e-bikes, and so on and so forth, or getting your small pilot's license. But mobility, and as many times as it gets brought up in different arguments, not only is key, but it's important in how we approach it. So, mobility, though, I think the most neglected element of mobility when it comes to the average individual is land navigation. Are you capable of getting from one side of your city to the other side of your city on foot without using a map or GPS? That would be a good practice to do. And if you can't, and the best way to do it is in circles, is to have a known area, explore that, and then expand, and then expand, and then expand, maybe block by block by block or borough by borough by borough. And yes, there's going to be some concern for safety in certain areas. Please be careful especially if you're living in Minneapolis. But this skill is important. Not only that, you might want to look at mobility and where do my friends live? Where does my family live? What tools do I use to mark where they're at? How can I communicate to them where they're at versus where I'm at? What are my alternate routes of travel? And so on and so forth. Mobility from where we're approaching it today is much less about the technical capabilities of, say, your vehicle and much more about, do you know how to get somewhere without having something tell you how to get there in a turn-by-turn basis. Let's go back to pre-MapQuest navigation capability. Yeah, sure, that way's north or whatever. So this is the big five, and I'm going to recap them, but I'll leave you. I'm not leaving you with this. This is the big five. I'm going to recap, but I think there are at least two more categories that are important for the average the citizen like yourself and myself. And let's look at them again. Marksmanship, physical training, medical training, small unit tactics, and mobility. Of those five, marksmanship is not only being able to hit a target with your firearm stationary, but it's proficiency with multiple types of firearms in multiple types of scenarios, urban, rural, in a vehicle, outside, around a vehicle, so long and so forth. Physical training is setting your ideal. What is the goal in physical fitness, and then pursuing that. The goal of physical fitness is to relieve the burden of being afraid, in a sense. It's a small way of saying it. Then we have medical training, and that has the least barrier to entry in some sense, because you can go get training with medical equipment. And then with a little bit of training, you're much more capable of making better decisions as to what kind of equipment you might want to stock in that environment. And from there, we go into small unit tactics, most controversial within gun culture, but also that makes sense because of how much of importance it plays and how new of a subject it is within the conversation. And finally, we have mobility, which includes vehicles, foot traffic, and land navigation. But I think there are two more subjects, if those are the big five that, say, Ranger Battalion prioritizes in the development of the individual and what gun culture might look at, I think there are at least two more subjects that are neglected or missing in that stack for us as individuals. And then there's, hint, a secret third. And the first one is going to be something like an area study. Now, again, a story would, if I can paint this in story form, I was having a conversation with a friend the other night, and we were talking about some of the absurdities of things that go on while we're in the military. And one of them was that I had not learned about what an area study was until after I left the military. I might have heard similar words, but it wasn't something that was taught in the way that we address it now. And an area study can look like multiple things: knowing local law enforcement, local government, being aware of the primary routes of travel, where are the danger zones, where do the gangs participate, where are the homeless encampments, where are the government centers, where are the police stations, especially if you live in Minneapolis and they like to burn them down every once in a while. It might be a good idea to know where they're at. And an area study extends not only beyond, and like it's an area study doesn't quite fit into the category of small unit tactics and reconnaissance. It's much more of an intel gathering sphere. So that might look like, which kind of agencies and information gathering tools do you participate in, whether it's social media, whether it's the local paper boy, or so on and so forth. But an area study, I think, is the sixth subject that an individual should be at least moderately capable of. And that might also sound something like situational awareness, but I don't want to use that word because it's worn out. But an area study is, quite frankly, knowing what's going on around you, beginning with what is nearest and moving further out. And that might be identifying weaknesses and strengths in your environment, assessment of routes of travel or logistics, supply lines. Where do we get our water from? Where do we get our power from? Where do we get our electricity from? Where do we get our gas from? Where do we get our food from? Who has the authority or even the ability to shut those things down? Do you live in a small town where there's one road in and one road out that can be completely stopped for weeks on end by a boulder that falls in the road? Well, those are things that you might want to know. And so an area study is a little bit more complicated on one sense, but it's also much more personal to yourself. Who are your neighbors? Do you have a city council? Do you have do your children go to a school? Who sits on the board of that school? Do you attend a church? Who are the elders? Where is your center of gravity of your community and your family when it comes to your immediate environment, and then build rings from there? A tragedy in modern American politics is that all attention is placed on the role of a single man, I guess in this case now a man or woman, who we call the president, without any concern for what is happening in the environment that we can actually have influence over. For a nation that likes to think that it rebelled against the king and wouldn't have any king, we certainly pay a lot of attention to whoever sits in the Oval Office. And it's not that we shouldn't, because that man's actions has consequences, and those consequences can often be felt in our pocketbook. It is not the same thing as neglecting our immediate environment and the environment that we might be morally responsible for. From then, so if that's the sixth subject, which is an area study, and that might be participation in your community or community building, the seventh one is communications. Now, nowhere in the big five did I see anything about radios, but communications needs to be thought of in two different categories. Not only the technological side, you have the one half, not two categories, two sides of the same coin. The one half of communications is the technical capabilities. Radios, maybe get your ham radio license, or radios, internet, and we're going to go to a class with Grid Base here on June 8th. to be able to better answer these questions. But not only how do you set your radio, or how do you put a fill in, or how do you use it to communicate, but what are its capabilities? That's the one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is a little bit more ambiguous, because that is, how do you communicate at all? How do I convey ideas from myself to you in a way that is effective and hard to mistake? How do I communicate with other people on the radio? What is the jargon that we use? What are the lingo? What do terms mean? What all of this kind of stuff? Communications is much more than just the technology, and being robust in communication might mean a little bit of public speaking. And so we've already covered the big five, 2 additional topics, and I think there's one more that is unique to non-military people, and that is setting an objective. Now, the military failed multiple times the American military failed to establish a clear and precise objective for both Afghanistan and Iraq. And the result of that was felt a couple of years ago with the horrible collapse of our participation there. Now, there might have been some politics involved. In fact, I think it's fair to assume that there were. But the issue that even preceded the giant bungling done by the Biden administration is that even year after year after year, at some point in time, the American military and its leadership either stopped caring about what the objective was, or refused to establish it and disseminate that further. And so the idea for us as individuals, as well who are not in the military, what this quite simply means is do the work when it comes to philosophy. What is the good? How do I pursue it? And that is where we go. What is the good? What is right and true and good? How do I pass on that information to my children? How do I build into my community? How do I make my neighbors' lives better? How do I do these things? What is it that informs me that I ought do any of this? Objectives, and what I think has been lacking most in the West, given a doctor sees only ailments, and a hammer sees only nails, and a philosopher sees only the lack of philosophy in that subject. The thing that I am addressing here for you as an individual is, do not be afraid. In fact, rather, steal courage to build in yourself character and pursue that which you believe to be good. It is not good enough to passively assume that you will make it in doing what is right. In fact, passivity leads to the circumstances which make us into villains. So, that being the case, and I'm kind of tying this in at the end with hopefully with a little bit of a bow, starts to point out how all of the other previous subjects might fall in line. The arguments that are made between people, whether it's a competition shooter versus a military person, all are ultimately bad comparisons if no established objective is put in place first. Now, you might be able to say that a person who is a grandmaster and competition shooter is most likely a better shooter than somebody who, say, spent 3 or 4 or 5 years in the SEAL teams even. But the question that the assumed part of that argument is that you have an established rubric or assessment by which that is made, or you have a standard by which that comparison is made. But the objectives and the standards of, say, being a Navy SEAL are very, very different than the standards of somebody running an instruction company. Now, or somebody teaching firearms marksmanship, or someone teaching how to shoot a gun, or someone who is shooting competition on the grandmaster level. Their objectives are different. And the identity that gets wrapped up in both of those loses its way when it views itself as the apex in all of our participation within gun culture. Certainly there are achievements to be valued, but what happens with us on the individual level is that no one, and I mean no one, no corporation, no government, no military unit can provide for you that objective that is deeper and bigger than yourself for the entirety of your life. For those of us who get out of the military or leave these higher tension jobs, oftentimes we find ourselves listless, aimless, without a direction, because too much of our identity was invested in being that thing, and now we don't have that anymore. So we pivot, we find something to fill that hole or that void. And this is the final subject that I think all of us who participate in gun culture ought, or not only ought do, but must do. If the big five from Ranger Battalion are marksmanship, physical fitness, medical training, small unit tactics, and mobility, and then in addition to that, we are adding area study and communications. All 7 of those subjects are all ultimately directed by what we believe to be right and true and good, and how we pursue that as such. So with that, I'm going to close this chapter out. I'm going to close this episode off because I wanted to kind of provide an idea of what, when someone says, well, there's more to being X than shooting. This is what many of those categories are. And perhaps you found some areas that you want to improve in, whether it's land navigation or medical skill training or communications develop, and those are things that you want to add. And an imbalanced person within Ranger Battalion isn't going to make it, because you can't have 0 physical fitness but 100% in marksmanship. You're not going to make it. So maybe a sense of balance is needed, and the fulcrum of that balance is and will always be, what is the objective? So with that being the case, if you want to support the show, head over to obsidianarms.com and give a check at their toolkits. If you want to support us directly, you can go to redactedculture.locals.com. And then, of course, there is redactedllc.com, where you're going to find our shop. And that is the last plug I have for you today. So if you have enjoyed this episode, please leave a comment below on what you would like expanded on, or what you think is missing in this list, and then I'll work with that, and we'll keep up the conversation from there. If you have enjoyed it though, please leave a like. You know how we need it. We need to grow somehow, and the only way that we do that is through your participation. So thank you for listening. Thank you for allowing us to have your ear for this time. And with that, I will close. Go forth and conquer.